They laughed at her while she bled, surrounded by men in uniform, tied to a chair in her own living room. She whispered one sentence that made them mock her even more. "My husband is a Navy SEAL." They called a lie. They called her delusional. And they thought this night would end with her broken and silent. But what they didn't know was that the truth was already walking toward the front door. The night began like any other, quiet enough to hear the hum of the refrigerator, ordinary enough to feel safe. The smell of dinner still clung to her clothes as she wiped the counter, thinking about nothing more than the long day finally ending. Then the calm shattered. Red and blue lights splashed across the walls, slicing through the darkness like a warning she didn't understand yet. The knock wasn't polite. It wasn't patient. It was loud, sharp, final. When she opened the door, she felt it instantly, that look. The kind that decides who you are before you speak. Their eyes moved over her skin first, slow and measuring, before they even bothered to meet her gaze. One officer stepped inside without asking, boots heavy against the floor, as if the house already belonged to him. Her heart started to race, but her voice didn't. She stayed calm, respectful. She asked what this was about. She tried to explain that there must be some mistake. She kept her hands where they could see them, her movements small, careful, rehearsed from a lifetime of knowing how fragile moments like this could be. But calm didn't soften them. Disbelief crept into their voices, then accusation. Questions stopped sounding like questions and started sounding like traps. Every word she said was twisted, doubted, pushed back at her like proof of guilt she couldn't see. Then she mentioned her husband. Not loudly, not defiantly, just the truth. That he wasn't home, that he was active duty, a Navy SEAL. The room changed. Laughter broke out, sharp, cruel, confident. One officer shook his head like she'd told a joke too ridiculous to entertain. Another smirked, eyes cold, as if her words were an insult rather than a fact. A Navy SEAL? One of them scoffed. Sure. In that moment, she realized something terrifying. This wasn't about noise, or protocol, or safety. This was about power, and how easily it could be used against someone they had already decided didn't deserve to be believed. The laughter didn't fade the way laughter usually does. That IT didn't pass, that IT sharpened, IT turned into something meaner, heavier, like a blade being tested before it's used. One of them leaned closer, his voice dropping, slow and deliberate, as if savoring every word. He told her women like her didn't marry men like that. Said it with a smile that wasn't a smile at all. Another added that pretending only made things worse. That lies had consequences. She tried again. Not to argue, not to challenge, just to explain. Her voice stayed steady even as her chest tightened. Even as fear crept into places she kept locked away. She repeated the truth because that's what you're supposed to do when you've done nothing wrong. That was when hands grabbed her arms. The movement was sudden, violent, impossible to prepare for. Fingers dug into her skin, twisting her shoulders back until pain shot down her spine and stole the air from her lungs. She gasped, not in protest, not in defiance, but in shock. The room spun as they forced her into a chair she hadn't chosen. Her body bent into a position of submission she hadn't earned. Plastic cuffs snapped tight around her wrists. Too tight, always too tight. Her chest was restrained next, pressure crushing against her ribs until every breath felt borrowed. Her feet barely touched the floor, and for a moment she wondered if they noticed or if they cared. Her home changed in seconds. The place where she laughed, where she slept, where she waited for her husband to come back from missions she was never allowed to ask about. It became something else entirely. Cold, hostile, a cage dressed up as a living room. Family photos lined the walls, watching silently. Her wedding picture, him in uniform, her in white, caught the light for just a second before an officer deliberately turned it face down. Another frame rattled as someone brushed past it, careless, dismissive. Memories trembled with every heavy step across the floor. They talked over her now. Point one lectured her about respect. Another about obedience. Words like procedure and compliance filled the air, stripped of meaning, used like weapons. A baton tapped slowly against a palm. Tap, Tap, tap. Each sound landing somewhere deep in her chest, counting times she didn't understand. She felt small. Not because she was weak, but because they wanted her to feel that way. Because humiliation was part of the process. Because fear made people easier to control. Her shoulders burned. Her wrists throbbed. Tears welled up despite her effort to hold them back. She hated that part most. Not the pain, but the vulnerability. The way they watched her face, searching for cracks, waiting for her to break so they could call it proof. But she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She didn't take back the truth. Inside her mind, she repeated it over and over like a prayer. My husband is a Navy SEAL. He is not home. He'll come back. The words anchored her when everything else felt like it was slipping away. Point one officer leaned in close enough that she could smell his breath. He told her she should confess now, while she still had the chance. That people who lied to police didn't end well. That she should think carefully about how far she wanted this to go. She thought of her husband then, not as a title, not as a rank, but as the man who kissed her forehead before leaving. The man who warned her that the uniform protected him, not always her. The man who trusted her strength more than his own safety. She lifted her chin. I'm telling the truth, she said quietly. That was when the room went colder. Frustration replaced amusement. Control replaced mockery. One of them turned away sharply, muttering under his breath, while another tightened the restraints just enough to make her flinch. They wanted submission. They wanted fear loud enough to justify what they were doing. But the truth didn't change. They could restrain her body. They could invade her home. They could humiliate her in front of her own memories. What they couldn't take was what she knew. And somewhere beyond the flashing lights and locked doors, the man they laughed about was on his way home. Time warped inside that house. Minutes stretched until they felt like hours, then collapsed into seconds without warning. She lost track of how long she'd been restrained, how many times someone raised their voice, how often the word liar was thrown at her like a verdict already signed. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, mockingly, as if reminding her that time was moving forward without her permission. Drawers were yanked open one by one. Not searched, ransacked. The sound of wood slamming against wood echoed through the rooms, sharp and invasive. Cabinets were emptied onto the floor. Papers fluttered down like wounded birds, scattered and stepped on without a second glance. Every private corner of her life was pulled into the open by strangers who felt entitled to it, that a picture frame slipped from the wall and shattered when it hit the floor. The glass cracked in a spiderweb pattern, spreading outward, irreversible. She flinched at the sound, her breath hitching, but no one stopped. No one apologized. Another frame was lifted, tilted under the light. Her wedding photo, point one officer held it up, squinting as if examining a fake bill. Her husband stood tall in dress whites, posture perfect, eyes steady. She remembered that day, the heat, the nerves, the pride she tried to hide behind her smile. This your Navy SEAL? The officer sneered. He laughed and tapped the glass with a finger. Looks like a costume to me. The others joined in, dismissive, confident in their certainty. They mocked the uniform, the medals, the seriousness on his face. One of them joked about Halloween. Another said anyone could buy an outfit like that online. Her chest tightened. She spoke up, softly at first, then with more urgency when they didn't listen. She corrected them, gave details she'd learned over years of waiting and worrying. His rank, his unit, the long stretches of silence that weren't distance, but duty, the things she was allowed to know, and the many things she wasn't. Each word made it worse. Her protests were treated like challenges. Her knowledge was twisted into evidence of deception. Every detail she remembered only seemed to fuel their anger, as if truth itself was insulting to them. Point one officer slammed the photo back onto the table so hard the cracked glass finally gave way, shards spilling out. Another stepped closer to her chair, invading what little space she had left. His voice was louder now, harsher, filled with a certainty that had nothing to do with facts. You're digging yourself deeper, he warned. You think you're smart? You think you can play us? She shook her head, tears sliding down her face despite her effort to hold them back. Her shoulders screamed with pain. Her wrists were numb, then burning, then numb again. Still, she refused to say the words they wanted to hear. She refused to retract the truth just to make the night easier. They mistook her resolve for arrogance. They never noticed the signs. They stepped over the folded flag resting carefully on a shelf, treating it like clutter. They ignored the way the house was kept, clean, orderly, disciplined. Shoes aligned, surfaces cleared. A quiet structure shaped by years of military life, by routines built around uncertainty and absence. They didn't recognize the silence for what it was. This wasn't the silence of guilt. It was the silence of waiting. She watched them move through the rooms, confident, careless. They believed they were in control because they had weapons and numbers and authority. They believed power meant dominance, meant never having to doubt themselves. She knew better. She had learned patience the hard way. Through nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering where he was. Through news reports she avoided because they hit too close to home. Through the discipline of never asking questions she wasn't allowed answers to. She knew how quickly control could shift. One officer leaned down close again, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. He told her she should start thinking about the charges, about how things would look for her later, about how people like her didn't win situations like this. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, not to surrender, but to steady herself. Then it happened that a sound cut through the tension, soft at first, almost unnoticed beneath the noise and movement. The front door to IT unlocked. The click was subtle, but it changed everything. Footsteps followed, measured, deliberate, heavy with purpose. Not rushed, not confused. The kind of steps that knew exactly where they were going. Every officer in the room froze. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A baton paused in midair. Hands that had been so confident seconds earlier hesitated, instinctively shifting toward weapons they suddenly weren't sure they should touch. She felt it before she saw him. The air changed, that a presence filled the doorway behind them, calm and unyielding. He didn't shout. He didn't rush forward. He stood there, taking in the scene with trained eyes. Her restrained body, the overturned furniture, the broken glass, the officers inside his home. The uniform they mocked wasn't on him now. But something far more powerful was. One of the officers slowly turned around, irritation already forming on his face, until his expression faltered. He took a step back without realizing it. Another followed his gaze, then stiffened, shoulders squaring too late. "Can I help you?" One of them asked, forcing authority into his voice. The man in the doorway spoke evenly, his tone quiet but unmistakably firm. "Yeah," he said. "You can take your hands off my wife." Silence crashed down on the room, and oh laughter, and oh mocking, and oh certainty. Just the sudden, terrifying realization that everything they believed, everything they assumed, was wrong. And for the first time that night, the people who thought they were in control weren't so sure anymore. The silence was instant, not the awkward kind, not the kind that follows embarrassment. This silence was heavy, unnatural, like the air itself had been pulled tight and held there. Every sound that had filled the house moments before vanished at once. No boots shifting, no button stopping, no voices trying to sound in control, that a tall figure stepped fully inside. He didn't rush, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't reach for anything. Authority came from him without effort, carried in the way he stood, in the stillness of his movements, in the calm that only comes from someone who has faced chaos and survived it more times than he could count. His eyes moved slowly across the room, taking everything in with clinical precision. The overturned furniture, the broken glass, the restraints biting into his wife's wrists, the darkening bruises on her arms, the fear she had tried so hard to hide. He saw it all. And for just a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Relief. Then something sharper. Dread. Her breath caught when their eyes met. Relief surged through her chest, so suddenly it almost hurt, but it tangled immediately with fear. She knew that look on him. She had seen it before, when bad news came, when things went wrong overseas, when the calm cracked just enough to reveal the weight he carried and never shared. He took one step toward her. An officer moved instinctively to block him. Hand half raised, authority rehearsed and automatic. The moment didn't last. One look at the man's face made the officer hesitate, unsure why his body had decided to pause before his mind caught up. "I asked you something," the man said quietly, an O angered, an O threat. "Just expectation." The officer swallowed. "Sir, this is an active—" The man interrupted, his voice still even, "is in charge here." The question landed harder than a shout ever could. A few officers exchanged glances. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone now, replaced by something tighter, something uncertain. Finally, one stepped forward, clearing his throat. "I am," he said. The man nodded once. Then his eyes moved back to his wife, still restrained, still forced into that chair. "Why is my wife bound?" he asked. The officer launched into an explanation, words tumbling over each other, excuses dressed up as procedure. A noise complaint, noncompliance, suspicion. The usual language that blurred responsibility until no one could be held to it. The man listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He simply let the officer speak until the words began to sound hollow, even to the one saying them. "And the warrant?" the man asked. The question dropped into the room like a weight. The officer blinked. "We didn't need a—" "Then explain," the man said calmly. "Why you entered my home without consent, without probable cause, and restrained a civilian." No one answered right away. The man took another step forward, stopping just short of the officer who claimed command. His presence filled the space between them, quiet and immovable. "You searched the house," he continued, gesturing lightly to the mess around them. "You used force. You restrained her. So I'll ask again, on what authority?" The officer's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to the others, searching for support that didn't come. Behind them, his wife watched, heart pounding. She had never seen him like this. Not angry, not emotional, but controlled in a way that was far more dangerous to people who relied on intimidation. This was the version of him shaped by discipline, by accountability, by a world where every decision had consequences. The man turned slightly then, addressing the room. "My name is Marcus Hale," he said. That a few officers stiffened without meaning to. "I'm a chief petty officer," he continued evenly, "United States Navy." More stillness. That he paused, not for effect, but because he was precise with his words. "I'm assigned to Naval Special Warfare," he said. Dev grew. The room changed. It wasn't dramatic. No gasps, no sudden movement. Just a shift, subtle but unmistakable. Shoulders squared differently. Hands lowered. Breathing adjusted. Facts have a way of doing that, but he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of what he said settled into the room, stripping away assumptions layer by layer. This wasn't a costume. This wasn't a lie told under pressure. This was verifiable. Point. One officer quietly reached for his radio, hesitated, then slowly lowered his hand again. Marcus continued, his tone unwavering. "I was delayed returning home due to a change in orders. When I arrived, I found officers inside my residence, my wife restrained, and property damaged." He looked directly at the man who claimed command. "I want names," he said. "Badge numbers. And I want to know who authorized this." The officer opened his mouth, then closed it again. Sweat dotted his forehead now, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found. Marcus stepped past him without waiting for permission and knelt beside his wife. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly. That was the moment she broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet exhale as the tension she'd been holding back for hours finally escaped. Tears slipped down her face as she nodded. Unable to speak, his jaw tightened, but his voice stayed gentle. "I've got you," he said. He stood and turned back to the officers. "Remove the restraints," he ordered, and one moved. Marcus met the eyes of the officer in charge again. "Now!" Plastic snapped open, one cuff and the other. The pressure vanished from her wrists, replaced by a burning ache and freedom that felt almost unreal. She sagged forward, and Marcus caught her before she fell, steady hands supporting her weight. As he helped her stand, he spoke again, not to them, but for them to hear. "You laughed when she told you who I was," he said. "You mocked her. You escalated force because you didn't believe her." His gaze was sharp now, focused. "That's not a mistake," he continued. "That's a choice." The room felt smaller. The walls closer. Marcus straightened fully, one arm around his wife, grounding her. "You're done here," he said. "Every action taken tonight will be documented. Internal Affairs will be notified. Naval Criminal Investigative Service will be notified. And if you think your authority shields you from accountability," he paused, "you're wrong." No one argued, and no one laughed. The power in the room had shifted completely, not because of rank alone, but because truth had finally been given space to stand. Marcus looked down at his wife, brushing a thumb gently against her bruised wrist. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," he said quietly. She shook her head, gripping his sleeve. "You came," she whispered. "That's what matters." Behind them, the officers stood frozen, stripped of certainty, exposed by the very facts they had dismissed. And for the first time that night, the truth wasn't something to be mocked, it was something they couldn't escape. He knelt in front of her, movements careful, controlled, as if the rest of the room no longer existed. With steady hands, he cut away what remained of the restraints, freeing her completely. His fingers lingered at her wrists, gentle against the raw skin, and he leaned close enough that only she could hear him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. Not sorry because she had done anything wrong, but because she had endured something she never should have faced alone. Then he stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't square his shoulders in threat. He simply placed himself between her and them, his body a quiet barrier that said everything words didn't need to. She felt safer instantly, as if the air itself had shifted in her favor. "This house is fully monitored," he said calmly, addressing the officers without looking away from the one who had claimed authority earlier. "Audio, video, multiple angles." A pause. "Secure servers," he continued. "Off-site, encrypted." The room tightened. "I've already made the calls," he added. "They're time-stamped." Panic surfaced in small, telling ways. A throat cleared too many times. A hand wiped sweat from brow. One officer began to speak, stopped, then tried again, excuses tumbling out in a rush. Misunderstandings. Procedure. Threat assessments. Words stacked on top of each other, hoping volume might replace truth that IT didn't. Because accountability was no longer optional. Sirens grew louder outside, their sound carrying a different weight now. Not authority, but consequence. The men who had laughed earlier stood stiff and silent, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. No one mocked anymore. No one smiled. They knew it'd be by the time dawn crept in through the windows, the night had unraveled completely. Body cam footage was reviewed. Audio was replayed. Video angles showed what words never could. How quickly disbelief turned into brutality. How easily power was abused when they thought no one important was watching. The lies collapsed one by one. Reports were rewritten. Statements contradicted themselves. Careers built on unchecked authority ended quietly, then all at once. There were no speeches, no dramatiques, just the slow, irreversible weight of truth settling into record and history. She sat wrapped in a blanket, hands trembling but free, watching the sun rise over a world that felt bruised but real again. She hadn't survived by shouting. She hadn't survived by fighting back. She survived by refusing to surrender the truth, even when it cost her comfort, even when it hurt. Because dignity doesn't come from force, that it comes from standing firm when everything around you demands that you break. That night didn't end with revenge, that it ended with reckoning. That a woman was beaten for telling the truth, and the truth walked in anyway. Justice didn't arrive loudly, that it arrived with evidence, restraint, and courage that refused to disappear. They tried to silence her voice. Instead, it echoed. Because power without humanity always collapses, and dignity doesn't need permission to exist. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth and survive long enough for it to be heard.